Chapter 6: Essence and Personality. Ouspensky drew our attention to another division of G's not to be found in any Western system of psychology. It was his separation of man into two parts, essence and personality. Essence comprised everything with which a man was born and which could be called his own, whilst personality was what he acquired by upbringing and education. Essence included a man's physical and psychological constitution and all that he had inherited from his parents in the way of potentialities and tendencies. Personality was made up of what he subsequently learned, and this embraced all his acquired tastes, likes, and dislikes. Even his instinctive likes and dislikes, which were based on what was good for him and what was bad for him, became colored in time by the whims of personality. This was because personality grew very rapidly and dominated essence at such an early age that the latter ceased to develop, with the consequence that a middle-aged man might possess only the essence of a child of 7. An infant had no personality at all, and everything in him was real and his own. But as soon as education started, his personality began to grow. He learnt to imitate the grown-ups around him, adopting many of their likes and dislikes and copying their methods of displaying their negative emotions. Some of the traits in the growing child's personality might arise not so much from imitation of the adults in charge of him as from his resistance to their methods of training him, and from his attempts to conceal from them things in his own essence which were more genuine for him. In later years of childhood, after he had learned to read, a whole new world of people on which to model himself was open to him, and his personality learnt to be still more elaborate and complicated. And this was yet another difference between personality and essence, that whereas essence was simple, crude, and straightforward in behavior, personality was so complex that it deceived even itself. For example, a man might genuinely deceive himself into believing that he was a great philanthropist, prepared to sacrifice himself entirely for the good of his fellow men, and yet have no real feeling for humanity, but desire only to dominate other people. The relationship between personality and essence was sometimes difficult to unravel. For example, a woman might appear to be a very involved, sophisticated creature who was always clamoring for attention, and yet in her essence she could be quite a simple person. Sometimes personality and essence were opposed to each other, so that the life of the individual was made difficult and unhappy. Yet it would be a mistake to take all this too simply, and to regard essence as the ill-treated hero dominated by the villain of the human drama, personality, for there was much in a man's essence which was primitive, crude, and even savage, and a great deal of his personality which was praiseworthy and desirable. Personality, continued Ouspensky, is a very necessary part of a man, without which it would be impossible for him to live a satisfactory life. What is required for man's development is not that his personality should be eliminated, but that it should be rendered much less active than it is. Essence will then be enabled to grow, and, as essence is the more genuine part of a man, this is a very necessary preliminary to his development. Ouspensky said that G had once described various ways in which personality and essence could be separated from each other artificially. He said that drugs, hypnotism, and certain special exercises were used in esoteric schools for this very purpose. For example, there were certain narcotics which possessed the property of putting personality to sleep for a time without affecting essence at all, so that essence alone manifested itself. The result of experiments of this kind might be that a man who was usually full of ideas, sympathies, antipathies, and strong convictions was found to be quite indifferent to all these things in his essence. Ideas for which he would previously had been prepared to die now appeared ridiculous to him and quite unworthy of his attention. All that he showed after taking the narcotic were certain instinctive learnings, such as a desire for warmth, a childish delight in sweets, and a strong disinclination for any form of physical exertion. The narcotic revealed how immature was the more real part of him. Personality was usually more highly developed in town dwellers and extremely intellectual people than it was in people who worked on the land for their living. And instinctively one feels that country folk are more genuine people, added Uspensky, as indeed they are. They are people in whom personality has got less out of hand, and in whom essence is more active, so that they speak and act more often from themselves. It is very important to realize two things: that a man's personality has been entirely shaped by the external world, and that it is put into motion by the driving belt action of external events. A man imagines himself to be free, but he is far from being free. Whatever he does is the result of external events acting on the kind of personality he happens to have acquired by similar means. He may have acquired a very noble personality, but should the shaping and restraining influences of his life be suddenly removed, so that it no longer matters to him what people say or think of him, then he can reveal himself as very far from being noble. This means that not only has his nobility been produced by external circumstance, but that it is maintained by the same means. At another meeting, Uspensky again emphasized the fact that personality was a very necessary part of us. We have to prepare ourselves for some profession or business in life, he said, and what we acquire in this preparation is part of our personality. A person who has not equipped himself properly in this way is not likely to be a good householder, and consequently he is unsuitable for this work. Uspensky then reminded us also of what he had said at a much earlier meeting, that humanity could be divided into the three categories of good householders, tramps, and lunatics. A good householder was a machine, but he was a machine capable of assuming certain responsibilities, and a machine on which other people could depend. A tramp was a man who was incapable of completing any undertaking in life, who always abandoned what he had begun. A lunatic was without any discrimination at all, a man who embarked first on this enterprise and then on that one, and who never attained any goal. Only good householders were able to obtain any profit from the work we were now engaged on. At another meeting, Uspensky said that as essence was the more real part of us, it was only from essence that anything real and new could arise, such as a controlling and permanent I. But, for this to happen, personality had to become more passive and essence had to grow. In order that essence should grow, it had to be fed, and its food took the form of a new kind of knowledge, such as that which we were now receiving. The situation was further complicated by the fact that this knowledge could only reach essence through personality. So the sequence of events for a man who was developing was as follows. First, his personality had to grow at the expense of his essence. Then his personality had to be rendered more passive. And finally, essence had to learn from personality how to grow. Growth in essence was always the result of understanding, and this had to start in personality, for we were unable to reach essence directly. Uspensky pointed out that for quite a long time, the division of man into essence and personality would be only of theoretical value to us, since we should be unable to distinguish between what belonged to the one and what belonged to the other. He advised us for the present to assign everything we saw in ourselves to personality, and to accept the fact that very little in us came from essence. There was another division of man which would be of much greater practical use to us, namely, the division between the observing eye in us and the thing which was the observing eye saw. I'm going to read that again. There was another division of man which would be of much greater practical use to us, namely, the division between the observing eye in us and the thing which the observing eye saw, namely, Uspensky, Robinson, Walker, or whoever the person happened to be. He said that all of us who were really working were made up of two entirely different characters: the person who still went about the world calling himself I, and believing himself to be a unity, and the small but much more real part of us which looked on and saw through the pretenses of the other part. This gap between I, known to the Vedantist as the witness, in Uspensky, Robinson, and Walker could be felt, and it was a very real gap. Yet, said Uspensky, A very subtle danger lurks even in these vital moments of separation, although a real observing eye has been there at the start. The process may be continued by something which is quite different, and instead of there being true self-observation, there may only be Ouspensky, Robinson, and Walker dreaming about themselves at work. We should keep a sharp lookout for this crafty substitution of the false for the genuine. This experience of what Ouspensky called separation, that is to say, the emotional realization of the gap which exists between the observing eye and everything included under the heading Kenneth Walker, became of greater and greater importance to me with the passage of time. At first, self-observation meant very little more than one or two eyes in me which were interested in the work, catching sight of other eyes in me which were not in the least interested in it, but gradually the nature of the observer changed, so that he seemed to be standing on a slightly different level than the rest of me, and this was as it should be, for self-observation is on the way to self-remembering, and to self-remember means to be less asleep than one usually is. At a still later stage, the character of the observing eye seemed to alter again, and all this was in keeping with a parable which Ouspensky had given us at one of the earliest meetings. It was the story of a house in which there lived neither master nor overseer, but only a rabble of servants, each of whom claimed to be the master of the house. All of the servants were in the wrong places. The cook was in the garden, the gardener in the kitchen, the butler in the stable, and so on. The result was complete disorder in the house, and this eventually became so great that a few of the more sensible of the servants decided that something had to be done about it. They agreed, therefore, to elect and to obey, first a deputy steward and then a real steward, for the purpose of getting the house ready for the eventual return of the master. What was of great interest to me about this parable was that the makers of it had found it necessary to obtain a number of symbols for the different stages of the organization of the house. First came the realization on the part of a few of the more sensible servants that it was impossible to continue living as they were living. Then the agreement between them to elect and obey a deputy steward, and then the election of a superior organizer called a real steward. The detailed character of the parable clearly indicated that its makers had themselves experienced a number of different stages which required illustration, and it was reassuring to me to know that the path we were trying to follow had been so carefully charted by those who had trodden it long ago. Ouspensky said that G had given an alternative parable to that of the house in disorder. It was a still more ancient allegory, which likened man to an equipage made up of a horse, carriage, driver, and master. The carriage represented man's body, and the driver was his mind. The carriage was connected with the horse by means of the shafts, and the driver with the horse by the reins, and, according to G, work on oneself always had to begin with work on the driver. That is to say, with work on the mind. The first thing necessary was that the driver should wake up, hear his master's voice, and be capable of following his instructions. He must then learn what he had hitherto neglected to learn, the right way to drive a horse, how to feed it, and how to harness it properly to the carriage. It was also important that he should keep everything to do with the horse and the carriage in excellent working order. The horse represented the emotions, and hitherto the horse had pulled the whole outfit wherever it liked, but now the driver had to control its movements by means of the reins in accordance with his master's instructions. Only then would the carriage begin to move in a straight line instead of meandering about in circles. But whether this happened or not depended first on the driver's hearing his master's voice, and second on whether the horse had been properly harnessed, and above all on whether the driver possessed reins with which to control the horse's movements. Ouspensky said that the symbolism of the reins in this parable was of particular importance, since the reins stood for the means by which the mind was able to control the emotions. But how can intellectual center manage to control emotional center? He asked us. The horse does not understand the driver's language because the driver uses words, and the emotional center expresses itself not in words but in symbols. We know only too well that it is useless for us to say to ourselves before a difficult interview, I shall refuse to be irritated by this fellow whatever he says to me, because irritation does not serve my purposes. Reasoning with ourselves in this way will have no effect at all, for our emotions often behave quite irrationally. We react to annoyances as we have always reacted to them, whatever we may have said to ourselves beforehand. No, talking will have no effect on the horse, and in our customary state of waking sleep, there are no reins at all between the driver and the horse. It is only in the higher state of self-remembering that we are able to exercise any control over our mechanical reactions and our emotions. In our usual state of sleep, we are drivers who possess no reins with which to control their horses. See also on page 150, which we will get to. Ouspensky told us that since our personalities determined our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions, it was very necessary that we should make an intensive study of them. And what fantastic things these personalities were when we managed to catch sight of them. Madame Ouspensky, who took a more and more prominent part in her husband's work after the year 1924, possessed a special gift for seeing below the surface and revealing to us what she had discovered there. She sometimes likened our personalities to large hot air pies, which we were carrying about with us very carefully in the hope that they would be duly admired. Her allegory was a particularly appropriate one, for the crust of a hot air pie is so thin that the slightest knock from someone else will cause it to crumble, and thus reveal to the world the emptiness within. Aware of this danger, we are constantly on our guard, protecting our personalities from all rough handling, insisting always that we are in the right and others in the wrong, and justifying our every action, thought, and feeling. To have to be always right, and, what is still more exacting, to have to prove oneself always right to the world, is a fatiguing and a whole-time job, and the realization that both of these obligations are entirely unnecessary brings with it an immediate sense of relief. Not that our personalities ceased to trouble us after we had realized their unimportance. No, they continued to control us as they did before, but we were able to enjoy moments of unaccustomed peace and quiet, moments when the observer in us was there, and when the noisy actors in our inner theaters were compelled to retire from the center of the stage and to creep off shamefacedly into the wings. And at such times of inner separation, we caught a glimpse of what it would be like to be real masters of ourselves, and to be in control of the erratic actors within us. In one of his many talks on the subject of personality, Ouspensky drew our attention to the fact that we possessed a number of different roles which were automatically assumed for different social occasions, and with different kinds of people. For example, there was a role which appeared when we were at home in the evening within the family circle, another which replaced it when we reached the office or other scene of our day's work, yet another which slipped into place when we were dining out with friends, and also different roles for use with inferiors and with superiors. Yet because a man's repertoire for roles was limited, he was liable to find himself without one in unusual circumstances, and the lack of an appropriate role always made him feel very uncomfortable. So also was a man distressed when two different roles clashed with each other, as when a bachelor friend with whom he has been accustomed to dine at his club turns up by accident within the family circle. It was also confusing to a man to have to play two contradictory roles in the same company, changing rapidly from one to the other. Again, it is William James alone who has realized the importance of the roles which take charge of us in different circumstances and with different people. He writes, "We do not show ourselves to our children as to our club companions, to our customers as to the laborers we employ, to our masters and employers as to our intimate friends." He also saw that many of these roles are incompatible with each other, and that they often are only products of our imaginations. "Not that I would not," he continues, "if I could, be both handsome and fat and well dressed, and a great athlete, and make $1 million a year, be a wit, a bon vivant, and a lady killer, as well as a philosopher, a philanthropist, statesman, warrior, and African explorer, as well as a tone poet and a saint. But the thing is simply impossible. The millionaire's work would run counter to the saint's. The bon vivant and the philanthropist would trip each other up. So the seeker of his truest, strongest, deepest self must review the list carefully and pick out the one on which to stake his salvation. But William James is mistaken when he suggests that it is possible to pick out a desirable self from the crowd, cultivate it, and turn all the others out. Crowds are notably difficult to control, and the crowd within us is no exception to this rule. We possess no central and permanent I whom the others will obey, and who is capable of making this selection and of issuing orders for the dismissal of all the undesirable characters. I'm going to read that again. We possess no central and permanent I whom the others will obey. So who is capable of making this selection and of issuing orders for the dismissal of all the undesirable characters? William James is postulating something which does not exist in us, a leader. The inner crowd obeys no one, but runs itself by itself in the haphazard way in which leaderless crowds do run themselves, shouting one thing at one moment and doing precisely the opposite thing immediately afterwards. It is this which explains the many inconsistencies and contradictions to our behavior. Why on earth did I promise to do that, I ask myself, when I wake up in the morning and recall the conversation of the evening before? I can't think what induced me to commit myself to doing anything so foolish. I'll ring up immediately and say that the whole thing is off. Ouspensky said that the study of roles was a very important part of our work of self-observation, and he recommended us sometimes to place ourselves deliberately in unusual circumstances for which we were without any suitable role. Although this might well be an uncomfortable experience, it will provide us with an excellent opportunity for seeing things of very great importance. Ouspensky spoke also of another part of personality's intricate machinery, to which he gave the name of buffers. Buffers were ingenious contrivances by which the shock resulting from one railway carriage bumping against another railway carriage was lessened, and he said that precisely similar mechanisms may exist between different parts of a man's personality. Life would become unbearable for a man if he were to be continually aware of the many inconsistencies and contradictions within him, and, in order to lessen the risk of this, he had created within himself a number of blind spots which prevented him from seeing the conflicts going on between his multitudinous eyes. These blind spots, or buffers, deadened jars and helped him to continue sleeping in comfort, dreaming that all was well with him, and that he had no need to be otherwise than completely satisfied with himself. Buffers, concluded Ouspensky, are appliances by means of which we can always feel ourselves to be right. Are they justifications? Someone asked him. They may be, but a man with really strong buffers does not see any need to justify himself, for he is quite unaware of any inconsistencies within him, and accepts himself as entirely satisfactory as he is. Such a man has complete confidence in himself and all that he stands for. What is the best way of seeing buffers? Another person asked. The time always comes, replied Ouspensky, when our work on ourselves begins to reveal some of our inconsistencies. We know that a buffer is placed between these, and, with practice in self-observation, we slowly become aware of what lies on both sides of the buffer. So be on the lookout for inner contradictions, and these will lead you to the discovery of buffers. Pay particular attention to any subject on which you are touchy. You have perhaps attributed to yourself some good quality, and that is an idea which lies on one side of the buffer, but you have not as yet seen clearly the contradiction which lies on the other side of it. Nevertheless, you are a little bit uncomfortable about this good quality, and that may mean that you are in the neighborhood of a buffer. At another meeting, Ouspensky talked about chief feature. He said that there was a central feature around which everything in a man revolved. It was really his chief weakness, and it explained a great deal in his personality. One man talked too much when he ought to be silent, and another man remained silent when he ought to talk, and this showed how teaching in this work could never be other than individual. He said that the discovery of one's chief weakness and the struggle against it was an important part of the work, but that chief feature was so carefully protected by buffers that a man was seldom able to discover it by himself. He had to be told his chief weakness, but he must not be told it too soon, or he would refuse to believe what he had been told. He would deny the accusation, and the more stoutly he denied it, the more likely it would be that the diagnosis was a correct one. Is there any way in which we can discover the direction in which our chief feature lies? Someone asked. If you can look at the pattern of your whole life, answered Ouspensky, you may be able to see the same sort of problem continually recurring in it and ending in the same sort of impasse. If you manage to do this, you are likely to be in the neighborhood of your chief feature. Understand that your chief feature is an axis in yourself around which a great many other things are revolving, and that explains why the fruits of your chief weakness are continually recurring, but few people discover for themselves their chief feature. Someone asked if there were any one fault in personality which was a greater obstacle to inner development than anything else. Ouspensky replied without hesitation that vanity was an outstanding hindrance. He said that G had always laid special emphasis on the importance of vanity, and had used these words about it, quote, "The fundamental cause of almost all the misunderstandings arising in the inner world of man is chiefly due to the psychic factor found in man's being at an early age, and due to wrong education, the stimulation of which gives birth in him to the impulse of vanity. I affirm solemnly that the happiness and self-consciousness, that is to say, self-remembering, which should be in a real man, depend, in most cases, almost exclusively on the absence in him of feelings of vanity. I have made it my aim in working with my people to deal mercilessly with all manifestations of this factor which hinder development and prevent any genuine relationship to our inner life, on whose harmonious adjustment all true happiness depends." End quote. Ouspensky advised us, therefore, to be on the lookout for our special forms of vanity, for we all had our own pet conceits. A newcomer asked how our special vanities could be found. By self-observation, he replied, by continuing to do what you ought all to be doing now, taking many snapshots of yourself. These will reveal to you in time all your ingrained attitudes, all the habits of thought and feeling which go to make up you. And when you come to lay out all these photographs for inspection, you may find that many of them come together quite naturally in groups, so that you begin to see the portraits of a number of sub-personalities in yourselves, a budding cinema star, perhaps a badly misunderstood person, or a martyr, a rebel, or a snob. When you have seen these minor characters in yourselves, it is good to give them names and become more and more familiar with them. Only then will you gain any control over them. I took Ouspensky's advice, and 5 years later the three sub-personalities I had discovered in myself, Black Hawk, Knight Patron, and the Personage, were used as material for the writing of a new form of autobiography. It was published under the title, I Talk of Dreams. Black Hawk, Knight Patron, and the Personage are still there within me, but they trouble me now less and less.